All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. So the title of my talk is ASP.NET MVC2, What's in it for you? And my name is Phil Hack. I'm the program manager with Microsoft on the ASP.NET team. And that's my email address, and that's my website, my blog. So before this talk this morning, I was a little bit nervous, and I texted my wife, and I said, I'm a little nervous. I'm trying to, work it out. And so she texted back that she asked my son, who's 2.5 years old, for advice. And he said, "Unchi bye-bye." Now, if you don't know Japanese, you just know that unchi sounds like a physical act that one would take before a talk, and you can guess which act that might be. So I'm going to talk to Hanselman to say that ought to go on his list of presentation tips. So we just released MVC2 last week. We've had a total of 6 releases: Preview 1, 2, Beta, RC1, 2, and then RTM. So a lot of releases. We continually put out these previews so that you guys can provide feedback and see what we're doing. Now, unfortunately, a few of my pet features were cut in MVC2. And before I go into what's in MVC2, I just want to talk a bit about some of my favorite features that were not in MVC2. For example, I was thinking what would be really cool, since we're going to present MVC2 at MIX, is if we had a Las Vegas edition that includes slots in the corner. You could take MEF integration, put a little plug-in right there, and you could play slots while you write code. But then I thought, no, what we really need is Clippy. So as you start writing code, Clippy pops up and helps you, kind of like we saw earlier in the keynote. But then I thought, you know what? We really need to take advantage of what's the latest crazes on the internet. And so there's this thing out there that's kind of scary, actually, but it's called chat roulette. So I thought, oh, I know. We'll do MVC chat roulette in the browser, so you get a random MVC guru to help you out with the problem. OK. So hopefully with your help and your feedback, we can get that into MVC3. So now that MVC2 is out, you might be asking yourself the question, what's in it for me? So what does MVC2 bring to the table that I might be interested in upgrading? And the answer is cash money. Yep, piles and piles of cash money if you upgrade MVC2. OK, well, maybe not quite piles like this. When you think about what roadblocks stand between you and your money, what are the things that are expensive when you're doing development that create friction? Things like repetition. Repetition creates waste. For example, I just wasted 5 seconds of your life. Getting hacked is very costly. So if people break into your site, they either steal money directly from you, or they create fear about your product for consumers. And both of those things can cause a hit on your business. So another thing is just the inability to bend the framework to your will. If you've ever run into cases where the code does almost what you need, but there's just that one tweak you need to make, and it's really hard to make that tweak, you can spend an inordinate amount of time trying to make that little tweak and make the framework do what it is you want it to do. And also, a slow site will make customers unhappy and miserly. So you really want your site to be fast. I think there was a study that showed if a site, there's a certain threshold where if a site responds in a certain amount of time, a lot more customers will stay on your site, whereas they'll just leave if it takes too long. So all of these things can drain your cash flow and your happiness. All these things make a product hard to work with. All these things make your site more difficult to monetize. So we really love our customers. So we took a step back and we thought, well, what can we do in MVC2 that's going to address these concerns? So we made MVC2 with more productivity. There's a key goal in MVC2. More security, more performance, more extensibility, and hopefully, if we've done our job well, more happiness when you're using our product. So that, in a nutshell, is what's in it for you with moving to MVC2 from MVC1. So I've mentioned all these things that MVC2 brings. Let's talk about how these things come to fruition. So what about MVC2 is going to make you more productive? So we added these strongly typed helpers, which provide IntelliSense support for when you're generating UI elements, such as a text box or even a broad editor for a type. So these things help wire up UI to validation, and also just brings the benefits of IntelliSense, which if you forget which properties are on the model that you're editing, you hit dot and you get that nice list. We also added templated helpers. So this provides a form of runtime scaffolding that, if you're familiar with dynamic data, which came in ASP.NET 3.5 SP1, is very similar to field templates in dynamic data. So you can associate a UI with a type, and we'll always present that UI for that type. And by UI, I mean both display templates and editor templates. So at this point, I'm going to show you a quick demo of both of these features. So how many of you here were at MIX last year? Okay, a few of you. How many of you were at my talk last year on MVC1? Okay, so if you remember MVC, that talk, I presented a site called Hack Overflow. So this is based on a site called Stack Overflow by Jeff Atwood, who built his site on MVC1. And I told him that, you know what, your site is so popular, I want to rip it off, and I want to make money too, building my own site. So I blatantly copied him and created Hack Overflow. But now MVC2 is out, and I'm realizing that, you know, it's time to freshen Hack Overflow up a little bit and try to implement some of these things using MVC2 contracts to see if I am more productive. So let's look at one of these questions. I'm going to click Edit here, and this yellow screen is expected. So I don't have a view yet for this editing a question. So let's go create one. So with MVC1, this particular portion of the demo you've probably seen before. I'm going to hit Control-M, Control-V, or right-click and Add View. And let's call that Edit. I'll create a strongly typed view, and I'm going to select the question class. And let's select Edit. All right. So what you've seen there is the Add View dialog. Hold on. There we go. The Add View dialog quickly scaffolded an editor form for the question. Let's quickly switch over, look at that. Did I do the wrong one? Sorry, what was that? One second, I must have, oh, sorry, question controller. I was in the wrong controller. Let's do that again. Edit. Okay, there we go. All right, so now you see a quick editor. I can now use this to edit questions. But one of the things you'll notice in the code that is updated is that we're no longer using strings here to determine what properties to edit. You see that we have these weird expressions here. Well, they're not quite weird, but and what's happening here is that we can use this new, whereas in MVC1 you'd use text box and you'd give us a string with the property name. In MVC2 you can say text box 4 and just m dot, and when you hit, you get the IntelliSense and you can see all the different properties of your object. So now you get nice, strongly typed access for rendering out inputs for each of your fields. And one of the nice things about these helpers is that they work off of the metadata on your model. So I have this other project here where I have all my entities. You can see this nice, clean, plain old CLR object, or what we call a POCO object, that I'm using POCO support for entity framework here. And you can see here I can add a data annotations on these. So data annotations are metadata that you can apply or attributes you can apply to your model. So what I want to do here is you notice here that this date created is, let me scroll that up. Oops, can't scroll up. Okay, so that date created there is all Pascal case, right? And what I really wanted to say is maybe creation date with 2 words. So I want it to look a little more like English. So what I can do here is call display name and creation date. I'll compile that. And now when I refresh this site, you can see here that the label for method in my view, so I'll just show you that down here. We have this label for method against the property, which renders out the label. That label for reads the metadata that we applied to the model and applies that to the field. So now, what I've shown you here with the add view was in MVC1, but the whole strongly typed helpers is all in MVC2. So another thing we can do now, though, is we can get rid of all this code. Let me just make sure I don't get rid too much. Here we go. I'm just going to get rid of all these little divs. And I want to make one call to a new method called HTML.editor4. And editor4 is also takes in an expression against your model. So I could say model such that model dot, and I could say I want an editor for the date created, or I want an editor for the date expired. But in this case, what I want is an editor for question. So I could either say model such that model, which looks weird, or we just provided a simple overload, editor for model. Now when I hit refresh here, you're going to notice that it looked like nothing changed. But what happened is that we're now using the editor for model, a form of runtime scaffolding against that object, and we're just showing these edit fields. So to prove that that's working, let's add another attribute to my model. So one of the things you see here is that I have this ID field, which is the primary key. And I don't want people editing the ID field. So I'm going to use a hidden input on that guy. So hidden input is an MVC-specific data annotation that you can apply on your model or your view model. And it tells us to render that field as a hidden input. Oop. I don't know what's going on in there. Sounds like a Jason Voorhees movie. So now you can see that we're rendering out the actual ID column, and we're just showing the value, and there's a hidden input in there rather than actually rendering out a text input. And I can even control that a bit by just saying, let's see, oops. Display value equals false. So let's say I don't even want to display the primary key. I can just change that to display value equals false. And now we're hiding that. So I haven't yet created a template for question, for the question type. So what we're doing is we're defaulting to the object type. So anytime and what the object type, the editor for the object type does is looks through each property, looks at the data type and says, oh, this is a string. What editor do I use for a string? By default, a text box. And it goes all the way down, and even with the date time, you can see that, oh, what editor do I use for the date time? Oh, I'll use a text box. But let's say, you know what, I want to use a nice date picker for every time that I'm editing a date time, I want to use a date picker rather than just a simple text box. So one of the things we can do is in our views folder, we'll add a folder called editor templates. And then I'm going to drag in a template I created ahead of time called datetime.ascx. So just blanking. What's the Windows Zoom keyboard shortcut? Windows plus? There we go. So you can see here I have this, thank you. I have this datetime.ascx file. So this is a template for datetime. And by convention, the name has to match the data type. So when we're rendering a datetime, we'll look for datetime.ascx in this editor templates. So now, when I hit Control F5, and I click in here, nothing happens. Let's see, editor templates. Let me try that again. There we go. I must not have refreshed correctly. So now we get this nice jQuery UI widget here where we're using that for selecting the datetime. Notice here that the date expires also gets that as well. Let's look at that template real quick. So this template is just a simple view user control. So much like anytime you create, if you've ever created a view partial before, it's the same thing. But what you get access to now off the view data object is this template info. So you can get information about what the field name should be in the markup. And the reason that's important is that you might have an object with a complex hierarchy and you have this nested object and the name is really hard to figure. You don't know the name ahead of time. So you can go in here, get this template info, and create these templates that are easily reused throughout your site. All right, so I just showed you strongly typed helplet and templated helpers, which provide a nice way to be more productive and hopefully reduce code duplication. And another thing that does that is validation. So with MVC1, we didn't include any built-in validation. With MVC2, we have validation that's based on data annotations, and a lot like what you saw in dynamic data again. And we also look at those data annotations, the metadata you put on your model, and we build up client validation based on that metadata. So in the keynote today, Scott Guthrie referenced that point where the validation in the client is based off what you put on your model on the server. So that's really nice for reducing duplication. And we also have various tooling improvements. You'll see me mention keyboard shortcuts. We've added several new keyboard shortcuts. And we've also added code snippets that work in the view. Oh, skipping ahead. So let me demo that real quick. So what I want to demo now is validation. So let's go back to this form and let's just clear out. Oh, whoops. 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right, so we're going to clear this out just for the heck of it. Whoops. Okay. Now you notice here that I left the title and body blank, and there was no message there. There's nothing that said, hey, these need to be supplied. But we did get validation, or what looks like validation, on votes, views, and creation date. And the reason for that is, in my model, votes and views are integers. And you can't submit an empty string for an integer. That doesn't make any sense. So we already have this concept of type coercion errors, where the value you submit just cannot be coerced into the type of the property. Well, obviously, we need to give you an error message. But for things like title and body, we have no idea by default whether you intended those to be required or not. Well, that's easy enough for me to fix. I can go back to my question, and let's make title and body required. Oops. Just copy that one for body. So I'm adding a required attribute, required validator, and while we're at it, let's add a string length attribute as well to show off a different validation attribute you can use. Let's see. Maximum length, let's make it 15. Minimum, that's good actually. All right, so now when I submit the form again, we can see that we have validation. So I think I put the string length on the title, so let's try just typing a bunch of stuff in there. And we see we have this message here, the field title must be a string with a maximum length of 15. So that's nice, but what about client validation? I want this to work on the client. So one of the things we can do very easily is before I call to begin form, I'm going to add a call to HTML.enable client validation. Let's refresh this page. Actually, let me go back. So now, if I go in here, empty this title, tab out, we can see that we're getting client-side validation. Watch as I'll correct title, and then I'll just keep typing, and you notice that the validation just pops up immediately. So this is a really nice way to get client validation without any extra work on your part. Of course, this client validation works for, the automatic client validation works for the built-in validation types. We have string length, regex, required, and range. Range? No. Forget. Okay. I'll remember in like five minutes after the talk, I'm sure. I think it's range attribute. All right. So great. So that's fine if your validation fits into those 5 rules, right? But what about the fact that you have custom validation that you want to apply that doesn't fit in one of those 5 rules? For example, maybe you have this idea that for Hack Overflow that you really want the title to actually be a question, and you kind of want it in the form of maybe a journalistic question like who, what, when, where, why, and how. So for the sake of demo, let's build out that attribute. So I'm removing enable client validation, so we're back to the server-side validation. And what I'm going to do is add a new attribute here, question attribute. And I've already written this. So all validation attributes derive from validation attribute, which is in the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. And there's one key method you must override, which is valid. And then there's another that's very useful, which is format error message. So in this method here, the first thing I check to see is if the value is null, and I just return true. And what I'm doing there is saying that if the value is null, I don't want to validate it. I'll assume that you have a required attribute on that and let that do the validation for that. But if it's not null, then I'm going to convert this to string, run it against this pattern here. And I could have used a regex validator, except I have this extra bit of logic, for a contrived example, where if you set must end with question mark, I'm going to change the pattern to it must end with a question mark. And then I just return true or false. What format error message does here is if the error message on the attribute is null or empty, and the error message resource name, so the resource name is the way you would, instead of typing a hard-coded compile time error message, you can specify a key into a resource file so that you can do localization, for example. So if none of these are set, I'm going to return a default error message that says must start with who, what, when, where, why, and how. Otherwise, I'm going to use the message that I'm going to call base.format error message and use the message that you supplied. So this is a way that my attribute can provide a fairly nice default validation message. All right, so I've written this attribute. Let's go apply it to the question. One of the nice things is once I have this attribute and build out my library of attributes, I can reuse these validation attributes over and over again. I only have to do that once. Just realized probably a bad idea to call that attribute question, huh? Is that question attribute? Great. Okay, that'll be fine. So now if I type in a question, this is a test. Oop. I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, sorry. Okay, so there I demonstrated a new feature of Visual Studio 10 where you can generate a class from usage. So what I accidentally did was this is for those who practice test-driven development, where you start typing out some code and you haven't even a test code and you haven't written the class yet. Then you can just say generate from usage. It's not what I intended to do, but that's what I just did. We could pretend that that was an intentional demo, if you don't mind. So let's try this. Oh, I know what I did. My web project references the class library, so I should have put that in here. Now let's build. And then in here, I can just change this to whoops. Okay. Dot question. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, now let's submit that again. And great, we get custom validation on the title attribute. So I can use that attribute anywhere and get and reuse that all over the place. Of course, it doesn't. Does it really work? Well, that's kind of a bad validation attribute because that's the question, right? So great, I have this attribute, but this attribute only works when I post it back to the server. How do I get this attribute to work on the client? So it would be great if we could somehow automatically take the code on the server and pop it up to the client. We don't quite have that, but what we do have is an infrastructure for you to provide the client validation and map it to the server validation. And I'll show a quick demo of that. So the next step is I'm going to add this question validator class. And I believe that goes in here. Let's take a quick look at this. MVC2 introduces this whole system for having metadata and validation metadata about your model that's not specific to any framework. So you could have validation, for example, that comes from Castle validation or your custom validation. But when you do use ours, the data annotations validation, you get some of the benefits that we have this ability to easily hook up a validator attribute that you wrote with client code. So what this class here is a bridge between client-side code and server-side code. So when we enable client validation, we emit a bunch of metadata about your model into the view. Let me show you that. Oops. So we'll turn on client validation again. Oops. And yeah, let's just hit this. Oops. Forgot the semicolon. Do. All right. So I'm using Notepad 2, and for some reason it doesn't remember your last font settings. All right. So down here we have this block of JSON, and it's a little hard to read, but the main point that I want to make here is that within that block is information about validation rules for each field of your model. And the reason that's important is that allows you to reference a validation script. So we include, by default, the Microsoft MVC validation script. And what that script does is when it responds to the document load event and it looks for this well-known block of JSON, and it hooks up all the client validation. So that means that if you have a custom JavaScript validation library, or if you want to use jQuery validation library, you can write an adapter for your own validation library and hook it up to our metadata. We have a project that we call MVC Futures. That library includes an adapter for jQuery validation. So if you want to use jQuery validation with our metadata and our validation, you can do that. All right. So back to the question validator. What this does is this examines the attribute, the question attribute, and you tell us what properties of that attribute, what information about that validation you want sent to the client so the client can hook it up. The other thing you also tell us is this key, this validation type. And that way, when we write our client validation method, if we match up the validation type on the client side to the server side, MVC will automatically hook that up. So the next step here is I need to register this so that MVC knows about it. So in global.asax.cs, I'll just uncomment this line here. And don't worry if I move too fast. I have a blog post I can point you to that describes this in detail and has sample working code. The main thing I'm doing here is I'm just mapping this question attribute to this validator. So I'm describing to MVC this question validator is the bridge from question validator, question attribute to the client-side code. And the next step would be to write the client-side code. Now, something we'll be interesting to see in the future is if we can use something like script sharp or some other means to actually automatically get this JavaScript code written. But for wrong one. Question validation. So what I have here is a fairly straightforward JavaScript function. The key thing here is remember that key, that validation type I mentioned? We reference that right here in this validators dictionary so that we can associate this client-side function with that validation rule. So this function here actually returns a function. So if you're not used to functional programming, JavaScript is actually a functional programming language. So you can have functions that return functions, and it gets very confusing if you're not used to that style of programming. However, the reason why we return this function is we have this bit of initialization code here. And so this outer function gets called one time when we register. This inner function here gets called every time we validate that field. So you can do a little bit of validation code. So you notice here that I'm getting this value, does it need to end with a question mark? And that's being passed from the server to the client. And then I'm able to use that in my validation logic. So now that I have this all set up, let's refresh this. And if all goes well, we should now see my custom validation working on the client. So let's clear that. Oh, yep, OK. Testing. Oops. OK, it didn't work. Let's see. OK. Did I compile? OK. And did I edit the right edit view? That's actually the question. So I generated two of those. I have this feeling that I'm looking at the wrong one. HTML enable client validation. And OK, so test. Sorry. Oh, did I reference the validation script? Rookie mistake, yeah. Yeah. So the issue here is that I haven't even referenced this validation script yet. So let's just drag it into here. At least I sure hope that's the issue, because that's a pretty easy solution. OK. So we got the enter title, testing. No? OK. Okay, so someone's saying that my registration is pointing to the wrong attribute. I thought I got rid of, oh, yeah. So I never deleted the old one. Okay, sorry about that. Oh, man. So now I should be pointing to the right one, if that's correct. And let's try it one last time. If it doesn't work, I'll move on and just talk it up as demo gods 1, fill 0. Okay. Oh, please enter title, test, and then the real test is who is this? All right, so now it's working. So as in most of my demos, thank you for helping me out. I'm a big fan of pair programming, or audience programming. Great. Okay, let's see. Did I show everything I want to show? Yes. All right. That always makes me so nervous when it doesn't go the way you plan it to go. All right, so let's talk about what's going to make you more secure. So I've shown you productivity improvements, but let's talk about security improvements. So we have this new auto HTML encoding syntax. I don't know if you noticed, but in my views, I didn't have less than %equal. I had less than %:. And you might be wondering, well, what the heck is that? This is a new feature that's part of ASP.NET 4, not specific to MVC2. So if you're running MVC2 on ASP.NET 4, so consider the fact that we support MVC2 on 3.5 SP1 and .NET 4. If you're running on .NET 4, you get this new syntax that does HTML.encode by default. So what we like to say is that it's kind of like less than %equal, but the equal's rotated so it points directly at you. So that's a good way to remember it. And but the nice thing about our syntax is that you can return a type that indicates to the framework that you don't want the return type to be encoded. So let me show you this real quick. Oh, wrong once again. Okay. So let's look at the edit screen again. You notice here I'm using this less than %: for HTML.editor for model. Let's also use this for just some script tag. You've been owned. Sorry, pwned. Actually, that should be an alert, right? And now let's go back to the, oops. Oh, yeah, gotta end it with the double quotes. So you notice here that when it HTML encoded that, right? So that's great. So anytime you're printing out variables, especially values that come from the user, use less than %:. In fact, we'd like it to be the case where you forget about less than %equal. So less than %equal, it never existed. From now on, when you're doing ASP.NET development and you need to print out a value directly, use less than %:. One of the interesting things is you notice here that I'm using less than %: for this call to editor model, but this HTML is being rendered. It's not being encoded. Why is that the case? Well, if you have a type that we added this new interface called iHTMLstring in .NET 4, and we also have a concrete type called HTMLstring in .NET 4. So if your method returns a type that implements that interface, and the HTML string is for convenience, then we will not encode that with the syntax. So that gives you the power as the library developer or the application developer to indicate that, you know what, this method is supposed to return HTML. I don't want it double coded. I'll take ownership of the fact that it's safe. And so this is a nice feature that now we can say that by default, ASP.NET does HTML encoding by default, which is redundant. All right. So JSON result is secure by default. So one of the changes we made in MVC2, and this is something you should really be aware of because I've heard from several people it kind of bit them when they were upgrading, is that we do not send JSON. If you just call return JSON of some object, we don't return it in response to GET requests. We'll throw an exception. And you can override that by passing in an extra parameter. to allow gets, but by default we require post. If you come to my talk with Scott Hanselman at 1:30, we'll show you a demonstration of an attack that shows you why we made this change. And what's interesting is the guy who invented JSON is actually here at this conference. I believe Douglas Crockford is giving a talk at 3, and I don't know if it's been updated on the schedules yet. So keep a lookout for that. And we also made a small improvement to the anti-forgery or cross-site request forgery helpers that we include. We'll show a demo of what cross-site request forgery is later today. So this provides the change we made was that we provide better protection for sites that are on the same domain. So if you happen to have evil.example.com and good.example.com, we protect the two from each other better with the new helpers. All right, so what's going to make your application a speed demon? So one of the new features we added is the async controller. So this allows you to call into some external service, whether it's a web service or some kind of other service running in another process, in a non-blocking manner. So if you were to call that web service in a controller action directly, the thread would be waiting for the response and not in use. With async controller, you can make it so that that thread goes back to the thread pool, starts handling other requests, and then when the response comes back, it lights up again and continues. And we based our implementation on what's called the async event pattern. So you have an action name. Your action method is split into two, the action name async and the action name completed. And so the async sets up the asynchronous call, and the completed gets called when the async operations are done. And we also did a massive amount of performance tuning through the framework. We do a lot of, especially with the expression-based helpers, since a lot of those would normally use reflection, we try to avoid using reflection and instead use techniques like lightweight code generation or caching. So what's going to make you more happy as a developer? So hopefully Areas is one of those features that is designed to help you deal with really large lists of controllers, so that if you have this huge list of controllers, it can get real frustrating because you're always can't figure out where you can't find the controller you want to edit. So Areas allows you to keep your project well organized, and I think I don't know about you, but for me, a well organized project makes me happy. And we also added a dialog for setting up areas called the Add Area dialog, which I'll show soon. And we also added render action. So render action allows you to call an action method from a view. So this is very useful for things like I have a widget that needs to be on every page. Maybe it's a weather thing, and I want to call it like I don't want to have to set up the data for it in every single action method. I just want the view to render that thing in place. So I'll show you. We also added an empty project template. So this just by popular demand, our default project template has a lot of functionality in it. A lot of people told us we want an empty project template, so we added one. So my next demo is Areas and Render Action. This will be a quick one. So let's say I'm continuing to work on Hack Overflow, and I want to add a blog section to it. I just want people to be able to post their blog post to it. So I can right-click on the project, and I have this Add Area dialog, and I can give it an area name. Now what's happened there is that we've added this new Areas folder. So the dialog noticed that, you don't have an Areas folder yet, so we're going to set up the conventions that make Areas work in MVC2. So it added this Areas, added this blogs folder. So if I wanted to add a new area, for example, called Games, I could do that. And now we have this Games area as well. And we also have this Games area registration.cs class that we added. So what this does is this is the code to register the routes specific to your area. You can see here I have this default route /games. The other thing to note, if you're wondering how that all gets hooked up, is in the default template we have this call area registration.register all areas. So if you're upgrading an MVC1 app manually, and you're adding areas, you'll need to remember to make sure to include this call into Global ASX/CS. What I'll show you a little later is that we also have upgrade wizards out there that can help you make that transition. So the next thing I want to show is render action. So let's add, where was I? So let's say the home controller, I'm going to have this weather widget. Return partial view. Let's see. Oops. We'll just create a partial view. And let's say the weather is sunny. It's Las Vegas. Great. So now I want this weather widget to be callable from every page of my site. We'll go to Site Master. And I'll just put it right above the header for whatever reason. I can call HTML render action and give it the name of the action, which is weather. Excuse me. And give it the controller name, which is home. And don't forget the semicolon. Oh, did I name it something different? Oh, I didn't compile or save it. Okay, let's try that. So now we can see that as I navigate around, oops, got to fix that. Where did it go? I need to add some styling issues here, but we can see that that text is up on every page. So one of the cool things, though, is notice I wrote this as an action method. And so what that means is that I can actually go directly to that in the URL, home/weather, and see the text. Maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I don't want to allow that. So we've added an attribute that allows you to say, this attribute is only for use when you're calling render action. So we call it child action only. So the idea is that this is a child action of the overall action that's rendering out the request. So now, when I build and then visit the site, you can see that I get this nice descriptive error message. It's only accessible by child request. Not only that, let's say you do want to make this thing, let's say you do want to allow it to be callable both as a child action and as a main action. So you have the ability to say if request.isChild, controller context is child action, you can have a different logic. So I could return a partial view, or I could return something else. I'm just going to return some content, because every time I do this demo, what I do is I return a full view, which uses the same master, which calls the same render action, which calls the same, and so on and so on. So I live up to the Stack Overflow name in that regard. So I'm not going to do that this time. I'm just going to show you that when I call it directly, we just get that content. But if I call it in the context of render action, I get it still works. Not only that, I can also pass in arguments to that from my view. So if I had a weather info class, this time I'm intending to generate weather info. And let's say weather info had let's make it a public class, temp. And let's say, so I need to generate a new partial here. So where did I do that? There we go. Let's delete that. So we're going to create this time I'm going to create a strongly typed partial with the, it doesn't show up because I didn't compile yet. So if you're wondering what keystroke I'm using to bring up the add view dialog, it's Control M, Control V. And the way I remember it is it's make a view. All right, so we have this little widget here. So so now from Site Master, I can say new weather equals let's see, temp equals 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's see. Oop. I must have hit a typo. Let's see, 1. Let's count braces. 1, 2 open, 1 closed. There we go, 2 closed. All right, so we can see that that temp is 0. What happened there? Oh, I know. So this argument needs to match the argument in here. So I called this info. So this route value needs to be called info. So we run when we call render action, we run through our MVC processing of the URL. So it's not an actual request. So someone had a misconception that we're making an actual web request. It's not quite that. It's more that we're running through the MVC pipeline in order to render that action. So now that I've matched the name of this parameter, info, with the parameter to the action method, once again, I hopefully keep the demo gods at bay, and we'll see that this temperature is 123. It's a pretty hot day in Las Vegas. All right. So what else is going to make you more happy about MVC2? It's open source. The source code is available. It includes jQuery and jQuery validation. And this is, I think, a very important part of our project because it embodies sort of the philosophy of MVC being very community-driven. And in fact, I've seen people take some of the innovations that we've done in MVC and apply them to web forms on their own. Things like the strongly typed views I've seen as strongly typed user controls, that people have taken our MSPL license code and were able to adapt it for their projects without any concern about intellectual property theft. We have a project upgrade wizard. So this is going to make it really easy for you to upgrade from ASP.NET MVC1. I'll quickly demo this. So this is you haven't seen this project upgrade wizard because it's only in the RTM of Visual Studio 2010. So I secretly installed the candidate build for the RTM. So don't tell my boss. And I'm going to show this to you guys. I haven't showed this publicly anywhere else. But the idea is I'm going to open project, and I have this Nerd Dinner. I don't know if you've heard of this app. But notice that it has that little orange icon. So this is a Visual Studio 2008 project built with MVC1. And when I try to open it, we get this nice Visual Studio conversion wizard. So I'll click Next, and then I'll click Finish. It's going to do an in-place upgrade without any backup. So I recommend backing up first. And you can see here we have this dialog that says, these class libraries are targeting an older version of the .NET framework. I'm going to say upgrade them all to target .NET 4. And it's going to chug along. And what it's doing here is updating your references. It's adding the updated scripts to your script folders, which is a common step that I always forget when I'm manually upgrading. And it's changing the references to MVC2. So you notice here that what we don't do here is we don't get rid of any existing scripts. So Nerd Dinner 1.0 was written back when jQuery 1.2.6 was released, but now we've added jQuery 1.4.1, so I can go ahead and take that and change my references if I want. And now when I run this project, we should hopefully see that it still works. If you run into any problems with the upgrade wizard, do let us know once it's out there. Not sure what we can do at this point, but and there's an out-of-band one. If you want to stay in Visual Studio 2008 and you want to upgrade from MVC1 to MVC2, the lead developer of MVC, his name's Alon Lipton. I'll make sure that I get that URL to you. He posted a tool he wrote for upgrading MVC1 to MVC2. All of this is also in the MVC2 release notes. So here we go, Nerd Dinner. It still works. All right. So on top of that, we made a lot of improvements based on your feedback to the framework. Bug fixes, API tweaks, all sorts of things. So all of these things combined together will hopefully make you a more productive developer when you're building web applications with ASP.NET MVC. And hopefully by making you more productive, it also helps fulfill the goal that I mentioned earlier, more cache. So one of the things that we want to ensure that we're doing the right things is we built MVC with a focus on transparency. And by that I mean heavy community involvement. So forums, Twitters, blogs, Codeplex, Stack Overflow. We look at all these different places. We'd love people to all go to one place, but we know that that's not going to happen, so we go everywhere. We also ship early and often so that we can get your feedback. We want to hear what you have to say about the product early on when we have time to make the changes that are necessary. And this has happened several times where I can point to several core features, huge features, big changes, major design revamps that were inspired by customer feedback. And so it's been extremely important to us to get that feedback in early, and that's why we have all these preview releases. We also like to try out new ideas. So we had these functional project templates, which means that we had this whole project template that had membership, for example, built in and account management. We include our unit tests when we ship our code. So that's 2,140 unit tests with 94% code coverage. And all that source is on Codeplex. As I mentioned before, we release under the open source MSPL license, which is an open source initiative or OSI certified license. So it's true open source. One of the other things I want to mention is that MVC Contrib, which is a third-party, non-Microsoft library of additions for MVC, recently joined the ASP.NET Code Gallery on the Codeplex Foundation. So the Codeplex Foundation is an open source foundation that's separate from Microsoft. Though we initiated it, it's a separate entity from Microsoft that can host open source projects. And what this foundation allows is that Microsoft developers can actually contribute to projects that are in the foundation. So it's made it easier for Microsoft contributions. So for example, T4 MVC, which is a T4 template that can generate action link methods that are strongly typed based on your actions and all this, was contributed to MVC Contrib by a Microsoft developer. So this is a huge advance in terms of what we can do with open source. That whereas before we could only consume it and maybe release it as part of our templates. So as we heard in the keynote today, Microsoft's looking to contribute, is going to be able to contribute to jQuery, assuming they accept our patches. But Microsoft more and more is in the position to contribute to open source. So that's what we have for MVC2. That's what's in it for you. And hopefully we can continue this on the road to MVC3, continue your involvement, which is paramount to our success. So thank you very much. Here's some references for you.